Hi everybody! Welcome to another episode of Deaver Farm Explorers. It's me, Farmer DJ, and I'm here at the Deaver Wellness Farm at Lankenau Medical Center. And today we are talking all about ecosystems. So we think of our farm as an ecosystem with all different living beings interacting with each other, helping each other. So we'll learn all about the different parts of our farm ecosystem and learn specifically about some pollinators, some animals, and about how they interact with the plants and us, the farmers. So first, as always, we are going to take a look around the farm, get to know what's been happening since we were last together, and then we will dive right into our lesson, learning all about the farm ecosystem, how pollination works, and all different living beings and what they have to do with producing food on this farm. So let's head on in and get started. In our last lesson, we were looking at some blooming flowers and some ripening fruits. So let's take a look at some of those plants that we have here to see what they are up to in the past couple of weeks. We can start right here in one of my favorite places to be, the flower garden. As you can see, there are even more flowers blooming than there were last time we were together. So what starts to happen this time of year, it's late July, and what we start to see is a lot of color and a lot of blooms. So we have all these different flowers blooming. Some of them are blooming for a second time. They've already bloomed once and then died back, and then they bloom again. So another thing that we're seeing, because we have all of these flowers blooming, is a lot of pollinators. We will definitely be returning to the flower garden a little later to meet our pollinator friends and learn how they play a role in our farm ecosystem. But for now, let's go take a look at some of those fruits that we saw beginning to ripen last time. We learned in our last lesson that a fruit, specifically on a tomato plant, will start out as the color green, like these here. And as it ripens, it gets a little bit sweeter, and it also turns into a different color. That color on this specific tomato plant is red. So our ripening process, with a little help from the sun and a little bit of patience, we see a green tomato turn into a red tomato, and all of a sudden it's ripe and ready to pick and eat. Remember our beautiful Buena Mulata peppers from last time that ripen not from green to red, but from purple to orange to red? Let's take a look and see how they're changing colors and ripening right before our eyes. So last time we noticed that all of our garlic had disappeared mysteriously from the garlic beds, right? It had been harvested, and then we took a trip to see where it gets bundled up and hung up to dry. So now the garlic has had some time to dry out. This process is called curing. So the garlic has been cured, and the next step is to clean it all up and make it into those beautiful little garlic bulbs that we are used to seeing in the store that are so yummy to add into our favorite dishes that we cook. Let's go take a look and see how Farmer Jen and some helpers are doing just that, cleaning up the garlic and trimming it up to make it ready to be eaten by members of our community. You might have noticed that there's one plant that seems to have grown much taller than all the other plants on the farm. Can you guess which plant that is? That's right, it's our mighty sunflower plants. These sunflowers have become not only a beautiful sight to see, but an important habitat for some of our pollinator friends and our bird friends as well. So they're visited by honeybees and other pollinators that are looking for nectar to drink from the flowers. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but they're also a really great source of food for our bird friends. So what we do with the sunflowers is that when they grow big and tall, sometimes the head of the flower, it blooms and then it dies down and then it becomes a head full of seeds. So remember in our very first lesson when we talked about seeds and sprouts and we learned a little bit about where seeds come from? Our sunflowers are a great example of seeds coming from a flower. So when we look at first the sunflower blooming with its beautiful petals all around it, what happens next is that after a while the petals die, the head becomes a little bit shriveled, and then as it starts to dry out, the center of the flower becomes a collection of tiny seeds. We already know that sunflower seeds are a favorite snack of humans, but did you also know that birds love sunflower seeds too? Here at the farm, when a sunflower dies back and becomes a big head full of yummy seeds, we hang it up on our fence so that some of our bird friends can come and help themselves to eating the yummy little seeds that are all over those heads of the sunflowers. This relationship between us, the farmers, the birds, and the flowers is a great example of what it means to be in an ecosystem. The definition of an ecosystem is a biological community of interacting organisms with their physical environment. So what that basically means is it's a bunch of living beings together in an environment, and it explains how they interact with each other in that environment. What are some other kinds of ecosystems that you can think of? Let's look at a couple of different examples together. Here on the farm, we know that a healthy ecosystem contains biodiversity. Biodiversity is when you have a lot of different kinds of living things all living together and helping each other out in different ways. Here on the farm, we see biodiversity everywhere, whether it's planting 2 or more different kinds of vegetables in the same raised bed, or you see a couple of different kinds of pollinators on the same flower. It also means that we have different critters and wildlife that come and visit the farm all on their own. These could be things like frogs and toads, snakes, groundhogs, and hawks. These are all animals that we consider to be a part of our farm ecosystem. Some of them try to eat our food and maybe dig up some of our soil, but that doesn't mean that they're not a part of what makes this farm a whole ecosystem. These kinds of relationships on the farm are super important to make sure that our plants can thrive, our insect friends have a habitat and food, and that we, the farmers, can grow enough food to share with our community here. Let's take a closer look at one of these very special relationships between insects and plants. So we've seen certain forms of this relationship when we looked at soil and compost. Remember all of those beautiful bugs that were in the compost pile helping to create healthy soil? That's one kind of insect that is on the farm that interacts with the soil. So those would be called decomposers. Another kind of insect that we're going to look at today are called pollinators. Pollination happens all over the farm, whether it's on our tomato plants, our pepper plants, any of our fruiting plants, the green beans, the peas, and we've seen some of that happening. But I think if we really want to take a closer look at who the pollinators are, we should go to their favorite place to hang out on the whole farm, and that's our flower garden. When we know what pollinators are flying around looking for, then we understand why this might be their favorite place to be on the farm. Look at all of these open blooms. Each one of these flowers contains something that each pollinator is looking for, and that's nectar. Inside each one of these flowers is something called nectar. It's what makes flowers smell sweet, and it also attracts all of our pollinator friends. Nectar is a source of food for a lot of bees and butterflies and even some birds. So when you see a bee on a flower or a butterfly on a flower, they're probably searching for nectar because they're hungry. But something else happens when they're inside that flower, rummaging around for the food that they need. Let's take a closer look at some pollinators in action to see what's really happening when they go inside that flower to search for nectar. If you notice, that busy bee inside that flower was carrying around a bit of yellow dust on its legs. That yellow dust is pollen, and this is how pollination happens. A bee or a butterfly or one of our other favorite pollinator friends, while they're inside the flower looking for nectar, they accidentally pick up some pollen from the inside of each flower on the way. And the transfer, so the taking of pollen from one flower to another, is how pollination happens. That's how we get the name pollination. It's transferring pollen from one flower to another flower. And this is how plants, a lot of plants, flowering plants, reproduce. Remember we said that an ecosystem is all about relationships. And pollination is a great example of one of these relationships between an insect and a plant. The insect gets nectar, so it gets its food source, and what it does for the plant is it helps it to reproduce. So each living thing is helping the other at the same time. Now that we know a little bit more about pollination, let's find out who's doing the pollinating. In today's lesson, I'd like to introduce you to some of our pollinator friends. First up, we have the honeybee. This is an insect that we see a lot on the farm. They're one of our strongest pollinator species in the region. Honeybees gather pollen and nectar from inside our flowers here, and then they take them back to their hives. Does anybody know why we might call them honeybees? That's right, because they make honey. They make honey out of the nectar that they gather from the flowers. They also use that pollen as a food source. So the pollen that they gather becomes their food. They use the nectar as food, and the extra nectar that they make into honey becomes a sweetener for us humans to use in our food and our teas and all different kinds of things that we need to be sweetened. Here on the farm, we see a bunch of different kinds of bees, like honeybees, but also the big fuzzy bumblebees that we love to watch pollinating our flowers. Another pollinator that we love to see here on the farm is butterflies. We can also find a lot of smaller flying insects that we would just call different kinds of flies hanging around our flower garden, specifically on this oregano bush. Let's see how many different flies we can see here pollinating our oregano flowers. There are other members of our ecosystem that can be pollinators as well, not just insects. So I'm thinking of birds, like hummingbirds. If you've ever seen a hummingbird, they're almost like insects the way they fly around and visit the flowers. They're also looking for nectar, and their beaks and tongues are small enough to get right inside those long tube flowers to get to the nectar that's inside. As they do this, they also can be pollinating those same flowers. There are even some pollinators that only pollinate flowers that open at night. Critters like moths and bats that are nocturnal, which means they spend most of their time awake at night instead of during the day. They go for some night blooming flowers, and they are able to do the pollinating at night while all of the other insects are asleep. Something we always like to remember about pollinators is that they are our friends, right? It's easy to see a bee and be a little bit afraid of it, right? You're afraid it's going to sting you. But something that we like to practice here on the farm is respect. So we have respect for our pollinator friends as members of our ecosystem. And in a way, we're all a part of this same family on the farm. We help each other out by growing together. We plant the flowers, the bees come and pollinate them, the flower provides food. We're all a part of the same system. So even if there's a bug that we're a little bit afraid of, we give it the space that it needs. So we like to keep that in mind. When you see a bee or something that you might be a little bit afraid of, if you stand very, very still and leave it alone, most of the time it'll just buzz right by you and keep on doing its busy bee thing, pollinating all the flowers it can get to in that day. So now we know what pollination is and who doesn't here on the farm. Now let's talk a little bit about why pollination is important for our flowering plants. Pollination allows flowering plants to reproduce or to make more of itself. To take a closer look at exactly how this happens, let's take apart one of our beautiful flowers here on the farm, get to know the different parts of it, and find out how that pollination happens and makes it easy for the plant to reproduce itself. Let's take a look inside a flower to see what each part of the flower does and how it makes the magic of pollination happen. We'll use this living flower that we picked on the farm to bring our trusty diagram to life. First, we have the petals. These might be the more familiar part of the flower. These petals are soft and bright part that helps to attract pollinators with their beautiful colors. Flowers also entice birds, bees, and butterflies with the sweet and lovely scent created by the oils, which are located inside the petals. The many colors and smells of the petals do a great job of attracting us humans as well. Inside the petals are the stamen. These little antennae produce that powdery yellow stuff called pollen that we keep talking about. When a pollinator goes inside the flower to get nectar, which can be found in lots of different places on the flower, it will brush up against the stamen and pick up the pollen on its body and transfer it to the next flower. If we can imagine that a buzzy bumblebee comes to visit this flower, it brushes its little bee body up against the stamen and picks up the pollen. It buzzes off to the next flower and brings it to something called the pistil. The pistil is made up of 3 parts. Let's start at the top here with the stigma, which is these little bits on the side here. This is the sticky part of the flower that catches the pollen. The pollen can be carried by a pollinator or can be blown in by the wind. Once the stigma has captured the pollen, it germinates just like a seed and sends something down called a pollen tube down the style and into the ovary. On the flower, let's see how that happens. So this is the stigma, the style, and the ovary is down here in the flower. This is where the pollen tube meets and develops into a seed. So when we see a flower's petals die back and watch the flower turn into a bunch of seeds in the middle, this is how it happens. So now we know that pollination helps a plant to make seeds, which allow it to reproduce. Can we think of another way that we find seeds from a plant? We can also find seeds inside a fruit, right? So instead of on the flower, sometimes that flower, when it's pollinated, it becomes a fruit that contains the seeds inside of it. So I'm thinking of a tomato or an apple or an orange, things that have seeds on the inside that when they're planted in the ground, make more of that same plant, right? So we've seen how insects and plants and wildlife all play a part in our little farm ecosystem. Now let's talk about how humans play a part in our ecosystem. That includes me and Farmer Jen, the farmers here. It also includes people like you that eat food. As farmers, we are interacting with our ecosystem every time we cultivate the soil, plant something, harvest something, right? We're contributing to the growth of the plants, we are helping them grow, and then we are also eating the food. As humans, we interact with our ecosystem, our large ecosystem, the earth, every day just by breathing in and out. And like we learned about in our plant parts episode, when we breathe, we are interacting with plants all around us. And I would consider plants and trees that surround us definitely to be a part of our ecosystem. Speaking of the air that we breathe, let's think about some other parts of our farm ecosystem that we haven't looked at yet. We know now that one of the most important things that plants need to grow is the sun. The sun is a very important part of our farm ecosystem. Without the sun, the plants wouldn't grow, right? The same goes for water. Water is also a part of this ecosystem, and the air we breathe, right? The plants also need all the sun, water, and air along with their relationships with insects and humans. So we also are in relationship with the elements that surround us here on the farm. The farm ecosystem reminds us that we are all connected as living beings here on this earth. Humans are connected to plants and are connected to animals and insects. And we all help each other to survive and thrive here on this earth. Well, that's our lesson for today. Thank you so much for tuning in and learning with us all about ecosystems and pollination and how all living beings are connected here on the farm and on this lovely planet Earth. As always, you can follow along and find out more information on our info handout sheet, and feel free to check out some of our past episodes if you haven't seen them yet, and stay tuned for the next 2 episodes that we have coming up in the next couple of weeks. So take care until next time. See you later. Bye.